Flawed and hard to believe, just some of the reactions to Venezuela's presidential election results. The state-controlled Electoral Council has announced President Nicolas Maduro the winner of Sunday's election. This will be his third term as president after an election that multiple exit polls suggested the opposition would win. Maduro says the electoral system is transparent, but that hackers were trying to compromise the outcome.
We suffered cyber attacks. We had a massive hacking. We know which country's behind it, but I won't mention it. A cyber attack on the transmission infrastructure of the electoral system. They didn't want the votes to be added up and for the final results to be announced today.
Well, Venezuela's opposition coalition has rejected Maduro's victory. They say their candidate, Edmundo Gonzales, won 70% of the vote. He's calling on his supporters not to take to the streets or commit acts of violence.
In other words, this is not just another fraud. This is a gross disregard and violation of the people's sovereignty. There is no other way they can explain and justify this.
Let's go to our correspondent, Alessandro Rampietti. He's following those developments from neighbouring Colombia's capital, Bogota. Alessandro, firstly, talk us through the results.
Yes, Elizabeth. Well, the Venezuelan Electoral Council came out announcing the results some 6 hours, and this was their first bulletin 6 hours after the polls closed, which seems to indicate to a number of people, observers inside Venezuela, that they were discussing or thinking inside the government how to proceed. But they did come out and announce that President Nicolas Maduro had won this election with 51% of the vote, and said that in second place was his main rival, Edmundo Gonzales, with 44% of the vote. And they also said that just 59% of eligible voters came out to vote. And this seems to go against what we had seen anecdotally throughout the day, with huge queues, with people staying in line for hours to be able to cast a vote, and also people that had spent the night outside of some of the polling stations to make sure to vote in favor of that opposition. So there's no doubt that this announcement came as a shock for all of those people that were expecting a change in power after 25 years in power by the Socialist Party in the country.
And Alessandro, Gonzales has asked supporters not to take to the streets in protest. What are the options for the opposition to contest the results?
I think we got some indication from the press conference that the opposition gave after the announcement. And one key strategy there will probably be that to insist that Edmundo Gonzales is the president-elect of Venezuela, that he won the elections by 70%. This is what they're saying, and insisting that they need to be able to verify the vote. And we're seeing already some international leaders, including from the left, traditional allies of the government of Nicolas Maduro, and in particular the president of Chile, Boric, who came out saying that he will not recognize a vote that has not been verified. And what the opposition is saying is that they were able to see only 30% of the paper tallies of the vote, and that they need to see the entirety of them to see effectively who did win these elections. This seems to be a first strategy, but obviously a lot will depend on what will happen on Monday, and indeed if the people will come out to protest on the streets. There's also great expectations on what other regional leaders might say, in particular here in Colombia. President Gustavo Petro is also a leftist and who has has been participating in negotiations with President Nicolas Maduro, trying to set up free and fair elections. We've also heard from the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who has said that there is great concern about these results, that they are not respecting the will of the Venezuelan people. And there was also a sort of a veiled retaliation there, saying that the international community is watching and will respond to this announcement.
Alessandro, thank you very much for that. That's Alessandro Rampietti keeping a very close eye on Venezuela for us from neighbouring Colombia's capital, Bogota. Well, let's take a closer look at Nicolas Maduro. A former bus driver, Maduro became a union leader before being elected to the National Assembly. He took charge as president after the death of his mentor, Hugo Chavez, in 2013. Since then, the economy has collapsed despite having large oil reserves. It's led to the largest migration of Venezuelans on record. Critics accuse Maduro of authoritarianism, leading a dictatorial regime, and of imprisoning political rivals. The U.S. reimposed oil sanctions on Venezuela in April, saying Maduro's government had fallen short on commitments to hold a free and fair presidential election this year. Once a top oil producer, the country's output has declined significantly over the years. Javier Farje is a historian and journalist specializing in Latin America, and he was an observer for the 2017 Venezuelan local elections. He's joining us live from London. Great to have you with us on Al Jazeera. So the National Electoral Council didn't release the tallies from each of the, I believe it's 30,000 polling booths nationwide. They have promised to do so in the coming hours. Does that hamper the ability to verify results?
Well, in the past, and you mentioned that I was an observer in 2017, which is correct, the count was announced very quickly because they have an electronic system which enables the Electoral Commission to issue early results. The fact that they took such a long time means that there have been some problems there. President Maduro has denounced there's been hacked. Again, he hasn't provided any evidence that is the case. So we wonder whether there's been some kind of coordination to make the announcement long after the closing of the polling stations. Now, the problem is that the Commission has always been seen as close to the government, which is correct. There's been, in 2017, the opposition accepted its defeat. There were regional elections. Venezuela is a federal country, so there were elections for governors. I was the observer in one of the states, and the process went smoothly, and the opposition governor, who actually lost that election to the Chavista, admitted and recognized his defeat.
Yeah, whereas
and the
this time the
of
opposition have come out absolutely fighting, saying that they're saying the whole world knows who won. You're talking about the delay in the results being announced. We know that there were some independent verifiers in Venezuela, were they not? Have they had sufficient access to do their jobs?
No, they haven't. That is the problem. First of all, the Electoral Commission, the government banned the European Union observer team to join the other observers. That's a good thing. That's a bad thing for the government because they were independent. I know personally some of the observers that came from the UK to Venezuela. They were all supporters of the government. So in that respect, many of the observers at the moment in Venezuela, international observers, are people who are close to the government or support the government, and they will accept Maduro's presidency, Maduro's victory. So that's one thing. Also, the opposition has announced that delegates from parties in Venezuela, every party has the right to have a delegate by the electoral the polling station. I saw them, during the 2017 election. The opposition says that they were not allowed to get in, to be able to monitor how the vote was being conducted. They are complaining that this was the case. But also, they are complaining that the amount of votes that they have confirms the tendency that Mr. Gonzalez has won by 70%. Again, neither the government nor the opposition have shown concrete evidence about why they are coming up with those figures. But the high turnout in Venezuela should have meant that the opposition had a good chance to win. Why? Because in the past, the opposition would either boycott the election because they didn't think they would be transparent, or people wouldn't come out to vote because they would know that the result is a foregone conclusion. This time, there was a massive, as your reporter said, in Colombia. I was talking to people in Venezuela. There were people who were queuing at 9 o'clock on Saturday night, sleeping on the street to make sure that they would vote against Maduro. So the high turnout should have benefited the opposition. And it turns out, according to the Electoral Commission, that has not been the case. And that's why there are many doubts. By the way, Colombia was mentioned. The Foreign Minister Luis Gilberto Murillo from Colombia has just said not long ago that he wants an independent audit of the votes.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting because as we've been hearing from our correspondent throughout the day, what Colombia says is noteworthy because Colombia also has a left-wing government, in fact, the first in its history. But Maduro has said after the results were announced that no one can interfere in Venezuela's affairs. So how susceptible is he to any pressure or scrutiny from outside the country?
Well, especially when it comes from left-wing governments. I mean, Gabriel Boric, the president of Chile, as you mentioned, as it was mentioned earlier in this report, refused to accept the result. And the response of the government was quite aggressive, saying, well, in Venezuela, we actually defeated fascism, unlike other countries, with votes, which is a bit of an overstatement because the opposition in Venezuela is not fascist. So the reaction from the Venezuelan government to Mr. Boric's statement about not accepting and calling the government of Venezuela a regime, which is a name that is used for authoritarian governments, it's symptomatic of how the Venezuelan government is very touchy about how alleged allies of the government react to this. Also, we have to wait about Lula da Silva's, the president of Brazil's reaction. He was very critical of President Maduro when President Maduro said that there would be a bloodbath and civil war, quote unquote, if he didn't win. Lula said it was very irresponsible. So it would be very important to know how the Brazilian government is going to react. We haven't heard anything
we'll be watching for that reaction very closely. Javier Farje, thank you very much for your analysis.
My pleasure.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.